So good evening and thank you for joining this guest lecture on riding the plant protein wave. And again, it's my pleasure to accept the invitation from the Univotech Food Technology Association and deliver today's online lecture. To briefly introduce who I am, my name is Supun Fernando and I'm a R&D scientist. I have a bachelor's degree in food science and technology from University of Sri Jayawardhanapura and master's and PhD in food science from North Dakota State University in US. My master's thesis and doctoral dissertation work were focused on dry bean milling and flour functionality. Before I moved to US, I worked at Hills Food Products, University of Sri Jayawardhanapura and Aquinas University College. During my graduate studies, I was able to do two internships at two food ingredient companies in US, and I have gained much experience in milling and plant proteins. I graduated with my PhD. I started working as a R&D scientist at Art Mills. Currently, as a R&D scientist, my main focus is on pulses and plant protein ingredients. So looking at the contents for today, starting from what are the plant proteins and why plant proteins are important, and then I will talk about the plant protein sources and how to manufacture those plant proteins, and what are the methods of modification for these plant proteins, because we can't always use these native plant proteins in the food products. And finally, I will go through what are the products we can make from these plant proteins. And as I will talk about one successful story and wrap up with the research gaps that we see in this plant protein arena. And then for today's lecture, I will be utilizing two of my recent peer-reviewed journal articles and a magazine article that where I was a guest writer. If you like to read and learn more on this topic, let me know. So I will be happy to share these articles with anyone who is interested. Okay, so who is ready to ride the plant protein wave? Let's start with the basics. What are plant proteins? Or in general, what are proteins? Proteins are polymers of amino acids. Proteins perform a vast array of functions within organisms, providing the structure to cell and organisms, and sometimes it transport molecules from one location to another, and it catalyzes metabolic reaction, DNA replication, and it also responds to stimuli. Uh, Most importantly, proteins differ from one to another primarily in their sequence of amino acids, which is dictated by the nucleotide sequence of their genes, and which is usually results in the protein folding into specific 3D structure, and that 3D structure will determine its activity. Each plant protein species has a unique composition of protein types. So when you look at the plant cell structure, you can see that plants also contain non-protein components like starch, fiber, and oil. There are some advantages as well as disadvantages with the plant proteins. As of disadvantages, there are formulating difficulties due to native plant protein functionality, and then some unfavorable organoleptic properties, and also some plant proteins lack some of the essential amino acids and vitamins. When we look at the advantages, they are healthy compared to animal proteins, good for good for planet, and it's more sustainable in protein conversion efficiency. So let's move to the next slide where I will emphasize why there is a huge need of moving from animal proteins to plant proteins as consumers. United Nations projections have indicated that the global populace will increase to 10 billion by 2050. One of the most significant challenges faced by the world today is to ensure that the growing population has the access to adequate, sustainable, and nutritious food. This growing population will demand 30 to 50% more proteins in future. So animal proteins alone can't fulfill this requirement, and it won't be sustainable. Food production contributes more than 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Our current agriculture system use 50% of habitual lands and 70% of fresh water. Most of them are accounted for animal agriculture. And also, for an example, with the coronavirus, 3 out of 4 emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning it's transmitted from animals to humans. Crowding, chronic stress, and poor health facilitate the pathogens to mutate in these animal agricultural systems. And also the current dietary patterns results in up to 5.1 million additional deaths through chronic disease mortality compared to a more plant-based diet in line with dietary guidelines. So there is a huge drive towards plant-based foods due to the growing awareness of the detrimental effects of animal meat on human health, the environment, and its inefficiency in protein conversion. Mintel, a global market research company, has done a large study on consumer preference on plant proteins, and here are some of the results. You can clearly see that the health is the main driver for eating plant-based foods. Environmental concerns are secondary. Here you can see it's 56% people are saying they are eating plant proteins to be healthier, but mostly whether it's environmental or animal concerns, they come to the second. Also, when we look at the investments on the alternative protein market, plant proteins make bulk portion of the investment compared to other alternative protein investments. On another note, alternative proteins include plant-based and fermented derived proteins and cultured proteins. So I'm not going to go into details of the other two categories, these fermentation and the cultivated proteins today. So looking at all this data with this market research and looking at the current investment, we can see that plant protein is not a niche market anymore. It's now mainstream. So what are the plant protein sources available right now? Protein sources in general can be categorized based on many criteria. It can be either plant-based or animal-derived, or it can be established, emerging, or future, or even within plant proteins, it can be cereal-based, or either it can be legume-based. When we consider different plant protein sources for our consumption or product development, there are a few characteristics that we need to pay attention. Protein concentration is how much protein we can extract from a plant source. PDCAS is related to the nutrition value. It's protein digestibility corrected amino acid profile, amino acid score, which means how much protein it's actually absorbed by the body. It doesn't make any sense, even though you have like a higher protein concentration from one plant source, but if it can't be absorbed by your body. So then we need to consider about the allergen risk. Some plant sources like soy can be allergenic to some people. And what's the commercial stage? Whether it's already established or still it's in the R&D state. Some plant sources like pea and beans, it can be less flavorful when you put it into a food product, but some are not. And then the functionality, let's say if you are going to make an ice cream out of pea protein, so what's the functionality? Can you make the foam out of that pea protein compared to a protein from a different plant source like sorghum protein? And what's the cost? How effective and efficiently you can extract the protein and it can be put it into a food product? And currently, what's the global crop volume? Whether it's already planting in a higher rate or still it's in a lower rate of harvesting? So this table was taken from Good Food Institute 2021 report, where it summarized the protein characteristics of different plant sources. If you look at each plant source, their proteins have different characteristics. So it can extract in high protein concentrates. Like here, you can see it in green color. That means excellent. You can extract higher protein concentrate up to 90%. And then when you look at the PDCAS, it's also a green. That means the PDCAS is high, but the allergenic, it can be somewhat allergenic to some of the people. Compared to soy protein, pea protein is now gaining some traction in the market to replace most of the soy products. But as I mentioned, so the protein concentration is not still up to 90%, and PDCAS is still low compared to soy proteins. But the good thing is it's a lower allergenic risk for people, and the commercial stage is improving, functionality is improving, and also the crop volume is improving. So likewise, we have to categorize all the plant sources and then decide, okay, when we are going to make a food product, what's the best source we can use? So, and the other thing I want to mention, not only single plant protein sources, but also blending two or more different plant sources can help to achieve specific product development goals. Sometimes they can synergistically work to make the structure of the food products. Sometimes they complement each other in terms of amino acid profiles. Like for an example, we do it in Sri Lanka by eating rice and lentil in our meals. And sometimes to make a favorable meal, to make the flavor tuning by mixing two different protein ingredients. Since there is a wide range of plant proteins, I will take legume as an example for manufacturing, modification, and product development in next few slides. As the global protein demand is expected to double in coming decades due to the increase in population, as I mentioned in the earlier, and new consumer trends, legumes or pulses have been identified as a nutritious and inexpensive alternative source of protein. Apart from their nutritional properties, legume proteins have been identified as having useful functional properties for food products, including desirable solubility, emulsifying, forming, gelling, and water and fat binding properties. The development of a more sustainable separation or fractionation method that preserves the nutritional and functional properties of legume protein is important, because now we know, okay, the legume proteins have good functional properties, but how are we going to extract this protein out of the seeds? So we have to come up with a more sustainable and a more efficient way to extract these proteins. So before we move to the manufacturing methods, first I want to give you a little introduction to the seed structure of the legumes. So this is a chickpea seed, you can see. And then in general, even though I'm just using chickpea as an example, for most of the pulses, the same seed structure they have. So pulse seed has three main anatomical parts. Seed coat, this is the outer cover, we call it seed coat, and the cotyledon is the middle part, or where the starch and proteins are stored, and then the embryonic axis, so that's the part that is responsible for the growth of the seed into a plant in the next generation. And if we dive deep into the cellular structure, you can see that the starch granules are embedded in a protein matrix. So here you can see these are starch granules, and this is the protein matrix. And also you can see the outer fiber. So if you can't imagine how it's in the cell level, think of it as a football being entangled in a football net. So our goal is to separate these starch granules from the protein. So that way we can make two different streams, one for protein and one for starch. So in plant protein extraction or manufacturing, there are two main methods, wet method and dry method. So dry separation is energy efficient and results in high yield, where wet separation have high product purity, but at the same time it has high energy requirement. Legumes can be divided into those that have store energy as starch and those that store energy as oil. Starch-rich legumes such as pea, chickpea, and beans, they can be dispersed in water to dissolve the protein and suspend the starch granules. Subsequently, the protein is recovered as a slurry by separating the starch granules in hydrocyclones. Oil-rich legumes like soy and lupine, they are first subjected to a solvent extraction to remove the oil. The defatted flour is then suspended in water, and a suspension of protein and fiber is obtained. For both starch-rich and oil-rich legumes, solubilized proteins are separated from insoluble fiber at pH of 9. So we call it alkaline extraction. Proteins then get separated from the soluble fibers by precipitating at the isoelectric point of pH of 4.5, and then subsequently the pH is readjusted to 7 to make it neutral, and a dry protein isolate is obtained by final drying step by spray drying. But the problem with this wet fractionation method is this process consumes large amount of water and chemicals and also energy. So compared to the wet fractionation, we are going to look at what's the difference between the wet fractionation and the dry fractionation. So a more sustainable alternative to obtain protein-enriched fractions from legume is dry fractionation, which uses only milling and air classification. The addition of water is not necessary here, and thus an energy-consuming drying step is not required. Another advantage is that the absence of drying step. So there's no drying step like we saw in the wet fractionation. We had to spray dry, but here we don't have a drying step, and also the absence of chemicals. And so these two steps, we don't use spray drying, we don't use chemicals. So this will protect the native functional properties of the proteins from the dry fractionation method. The major drawback in this dry fractionation is its relatively modest enrichment, which means you can't achieve a higher purity like you would achieve in wet fractionation, because in wet fractionation you can go up to 85%, 90% of protein, but in the dry fractionation you can only achieve 75% or 80%. But the good thing is most of the food systems do not contain very high protein purity, but they only utilize the complex composition of the protein, starch, fiber, and other components to achieve the desired functionality. So therefore, it is not always necessary to separate ingredients into individual components with high purity at their molecular levels. Like, you don't need to achieve this 90% protein concentration for most of the food products that you are going to make. You can achieve your food product by 75% of protein concentration. So furthermore, due to mild processing conditions, protein concentrates are they have the native functionality, and it's a good thing compared to the wet fractionation. And apart from these two different fractionation method, wet or dry, now you can use hybrid method. You first start with the dry fractionation until you come to the fine fraction. So this fine fraction is the protein, coarse fraction is the starch. So after you achieve this, if you want to further um, purify your material, you can use another step using water to purify your protein material. So we call it hybrid. So you start with the dry methods, it's only milling and air classification. We don't use water until up to this point. And later we use the water to purify more of your protein out of some of the insoluble fibers. So I would like to pay more time to the dry fractionation. So I just explained the overview in the previous slide, but I would like to dive deep into the dry fractionation method. So you start with the seeds from here, and the first step will be dehulling. So if you can remember the seed structure that I showed you in a previous slide with the chickpea, we have the outer cover, and now our goal is to remove that outer cover because most of the anti-nutrients and the unfavorable favor compounds are mostly present in the seed coat. So dehulling is the process of seed coat removal from the seed. Dehulling of legumes prior to milling and separation can affect the physical properties, chemical composition, and the techno-functional properties of your final protein fraction. Attrition type dehullers like hammer mills, which use the impact force, are suitable for dehulling legumes with loose seed coat because some grains have a loose seed coat. It is easy to remove the seed coat. Some are not. You have to abrase it very hard to remove the seed coat or the outer cover. So the abrasive type dehullers are used to remove the seed coat of seeds that are having a tightly adhered seed coat. But all in all, you can use some pre-treatments, like we call it tempering. So you put water and you shake it and keep for a while. So then it will be easy to run through the dehuller to separate your seed coat. So in a normal wheat milling process, that's the first step. You get the wheat and you temper into a certain level of moisture level, and then you run it through the mill. Then it's easy to separate the bran out of the seed. So the same principle we are going to use for the legumes or pulses. You can put water, you shake it, we call it tempering, and then the seed coat will be loosened from the cotyledon. There will be a gap. So when you run it through the abrasive type mill, you can remove the seed coat. So after dehulling, we come to the milling and air classification. So this is the main part of the dry fractionation. So I'm sharing a small video clip on how the milling and the air classification happens. So this is the basic setup for the milling and the air classification. So you have a dosing unit, classifier mill, and the classifier itself. And then you have two different separate streams for the coarse product and the fine product. So the blue color arrows were the air that comes to the system, and this is the material feeding through the feeding funnel. And there's a detection system to remove the impurities like metals or any other impurities like stones. And then it will be fed into the mill. It's an impact mill. where you throw the materials into the wall, so then it will be burst into small pieces. So this is the part, the impact mill. So the small particles, after it get milled, it will be thrown into it will be sent into the air classifier for further classification. So when you throw the material, it will hit the wall or the plates, then it will be break into small pieces, and then it will go through the impact classifier itself to the large classifier. So from the classifier, it will select the small particles and the large particles. So the small particles will be come down to the protein. It will come down as the protein fraction, and the large particles will come down as the starch fraction. For the entire system, we are not using any water or chemicals, as you saw. We just feed the material, it breaks into small pieces using air. We carry them, and the classifier, classifier as an sieve. So if it is small enough to go through the classifier, and it will go to the protein stream. If not, it will be collected into the starch stream. So I explained to you how the starch and protein present in the cell structure. So it's like the football net, like the footballs are entangled in that net. So we are separating those footballs from the net. So footballs are starch granules, and the net is the protein matrix. So in total, the principle is we have to carefully mill our material, mill our seeds into a fine particle size, and then separate them based on their size and density. You saw that we only use the air. So what air is going to do, because we now mill into a small particle size, starch and protein have different particle size and density. Starch are largest in size, and also the density is high. So that's why when you put air to the milled material, it can easily separate protein because it's small, it's less in density, so it can be carried through your classifier. So after the classification, so right now in the industry, we only go until this point. We dehull, we mill, we air classify, and we make the fine fraction and the coarse fraction. But there are some research has done, can we further purify just using physical method? I mentioned about a hybrid method, but where you are going to use water in the hybrid method. But this is not a hybrid method. This is just further exploring the possibility of using just physical method of using the electrostatic separation. So when you have the fine and coarse fraction, you will run it through an electrostatic separator. So electrostatic separation is a method to separate particles by using electric forces. It will charge the materials. So electrostatic separation is mainly used in mineral industry, it's not common in food industry, but now it's becoming more common to the food industry too. So triboelectrification is one of the most interesting out of several types of electrostatic charging mechanism for the dry separation. So what happens in this method? This method brings two materials into contact with each other, causing electron transfer from one surface to one material to the other. Various research groups have constructed different electrostatic separators to partition materials into protein-rich and carbohydrate-rich fractions. So it's the same principle. You give the electrons. So based on their electrostatic ability, they will be separated. When it comes to the separation, protein starch mixtures, the protein can be charged to a much higher extent than the carbohydrate, because if you can remember from your A levels or even in your degree, the protein has protein is made out of amino acids, and these amino acids have N terminus and C terminus, so it can be easily take the electrons. So, but conversely, most carbohydrates, they are low ionizable due to the lack of ionizable groups compared to the proteins in the chemical structure. So direct electrostatic separation of starch containing legume flours was shown to be infeasible and need to follow by a classification step, meaning you can't just come to this. You come from seed, dehulling, milling, and you can't jump to electrostatic separation for the separation for protein and starch. First, you have to go through the air classification, meaning based on the size and the density, first you separate to find and coarse fraction. Only if you want to further purify your material, then only you can use the electrostatic separation. So after protein extraction, what's the next? So we have to modify our proteins because it cannot be used directly in their native forms. Pulse protein ingredients can be incorporated into different food systems to increase the nutritional value and to achieve the desired functionality. Currently, many plant-based alternative proteins include pulses, face several formulation challenges, especially in the nutritional, sensory, and functional aspects. Native pulse protein ingredients can contain anti-nutrients, beanie flavor, and undesirable functionality. Modification can be done using physical, chemical, and biological methods, or else you can combine all of these to improve the pulse protein ingredients at the micro level of their desired use. These modification processes will thermodynamically change the structure and conformational characteristics of protein. Overall, the modification process expect to improve the protein characteristics. So here you can see there are many methods that you can, after you extract the protein, it can be from wet method or dry method. You have the native protein. So now you are going to use either physical, chemical, or biological methods, or it can be a complex situation like combining all of these. So physical methods are more sustainable, but due to the limited time today, I'm going to only explain the biological methods, the enzymatic method and the fermentation. So in the enzymatic method, a protein can be modified using the control application of enzymes. Like it can be proteolytic or non-proteolytic enzymes. So the desired characteristics can be achieved through the enzyme modification, either by dissociation, meaning you dissociate, you break down the protein, or it can be association, you bring some proteins together, or change the protein structure. So for an example, proteolytic enzymes like pepsin or trypsin, it can be used to hydrolyze peptide linkages in the protein primary amino acid sequence. And then non-proteolytic enzymes like transglutaminase can be used to associate, bring together different proteins and bind them into one sequence through the cross-linking. And the other one is like enzymes like glutaminase can be used to deamidate. Like I mentioned, you can change the structure. Either you break, you bring together, or you cross-link, or either you change the structure. So glutaminase can be used to do that, to change the amide group to a carboxylic group. So then that's the enzymatic method. And then the fermentation, it's a traditional method employed to optimize nutritional properties and the functional properties, and as well as to reduce some off flavors. During the fermentation, microorganisms produce enzymes that will create proteolytic cleavage in the protein, and it will break down into lower molecular weight amino acids and peptides. There can be two different methods of fermentation. It can be solid state and the submerged fermentation. So in the solid state fermentation, you do not require water, or you will only require a very limited amount of water. And submerged fermentation requires more water compared to the solid state fermentation. So the submerged fermentation is not preferred. Solid state fermentation is preferred because it will produce higher yield, and it's efficient in waste management, and also it's favorable functional it's favorable final product characteristics. So after protein extraction and modification, what's next? So now the protein will be incorporated into a food product. Meat alternatives, dairy alternatives, egg alternatives, and other meals and snacks are more popular with this plant protein whale. Due to the limited time, I will be only focusing on the meat alternatives today. So looking at the meat alternatives, first let's start with what are the ingredients we want to make a meat alternative. So normally water is the main ingredient, and then it can be texturized base protein, fat, binders, flavor, salt, preservatives, and color. Think like a sausage. For most of the sausages, we use all of these. So instead of meat, we are going to use the texture based protein. It can be from any of the plant sources. It can be pea protein, soy protein, chickpea. So right now, most of you eat TVP. It's made out of the soy protein. So it can be made out of pea protein also. So likewise, so it can be different plant sources to make this textured based protein, but fat, binders, flavors, salt, they are common to all of these. But it's a matter of balancing between the flavor and the other ingredients. So fat can be like either you can use coconut oil, palm oil, or different oil types to match the flavor profile that you need. So when you make the product like a meat alternative, first we need to understand what are the expectations from our consumers. People want to eat meat alternative, which is made out of plant-based proteins, but they are expecting it to be act like a meat. They want to eat a sausage that's made out of plants, but they want to act that sausage as of made of animal proteins. So people are expecting certain level of flavor, texture, and appearance. And also we need to consider what the consumer is asking for, whether they are looking for high protein in your meat alternative, are they looking for other iron and vitamins in the product. So we need to be careful. As I mentioned, in the plant proteins, they are lack of some of the essential amino acids and also some of the vitamins. So we need to be careful on that aspect too. And then what types are available? It can be burgers, sausages, nuggets, or either it can be whole cut muscle. Like now there are research done to see whether can we make whole steak or whole chicken instead of making burger patties or instead of making sausage. So we need to consider what's the product type people are looking for. So there are a lot of areas of opportunities because you can change with, you can play with texture, flavor, and the variety. Like right now, there's a market for steak and chicken, and moving forward, people will be asking for goat, lamb, which are made out of plant proteins. And then what's the consumer experience? As I mentioned, most people are expecting your plant-based sausage or plant-based um, burger patty to act as an animal patty. So when you bite it, whether you can feel that same texture, and when you throw it into a grill in the oven, can you hear that sizzling noise because of the fat from the animal sources? So we need to replicate that with the plant proteins too. So these are the areas of opportunities. We can improve the health by combining different animal proteins to get a complete amino acid profile, or we can combine them to get a higher value of vitamins that are lacking in some of the plant sources. So these are the opportunities that we can play around and make a good product from the plant-based proteins. And the basic method is like you get all the ingredients together, you mix it, and then you form. We call it extrusion. In the next slide, I will be explaining the extrusion. And then either it can be pre-cooked, and then it will be packed and cold storage. So that's the general flow for the making of an alternative meat out of plant-based protein. So this is the flow of the extrusion. So you saw now we have all the ingredients, the plant protein, fat, flavor, and so now we are going to mix it and then form into a meat. So for that, we can do it in two different ways. It can be either dry extrusion, or we call it low moisture extrusion, or it can be high moisture extrusion. So for an example, in Sri Lanka, we normally eat TVP or soya meat. So it comes from the low moisture extrusion, where you can have a lot of air bubbles inside the matrix. In the high moisture extrusion, it's like this. So you don't have that much of air cells in between your structure. So whatever the method, we are going to use extrusion. In the end, if there's a cooling die like this, we call this cooling die, it makes the difference whether it's going to be a TVP or is it going to be a high moisture meat analog like this. So meat alternatives mainly produced through the extrusion method. Extrusion can be either dry like this, or either it can be wet like this. So during extrusion, what happens? We start with the native state. So protein is like this. So protein undergoes the thermal and mechanical stress by heating, pressure, and shearing, which will help to unfold the native globular proteins and form continuous and viscoelastic mass. Because it's important to make this native globular protein to a continuous protein, linear protein, because if you can remember from A levels or even in your degree, if you are studying the animal proteins, they are more linear. But in the animal proteins, most of the proteins are globular. So if you are going to make an animal alternative product from a plant source, the first thing you have to do, you have to make this globular protein into linear ones like this. So for that, in the extrusion, by using the high temperature, high pressure, and the shearing action, you can make continuous and viscoelastic mass. So this viscoelastic mass can be aligned, cross-linked, reformed, and converted into an expandable structure that has a meat-like structure. So from the cooling die, you can make it more aligned state. So that way it will represent the animal proteins. High moisture and low moisture extrusion methods can be used based on the final product requirement. As I mentioned, do you need a TVP? So you go with this one, low moisture extrusion, and then using the TVP, you blend it with other ingredients, and you can make another burger patty with the TVP. from the high moisture extrusion, you can directly make a meat analog. Like, let's say you go to the market and you buy chicken. So the high moisture meat analogs, idea is to make chicken like meat from one step without going through the low moisture extrusion with blending with other ingredients. So the extrusion process is capable of reducing the heat liable compounds like phytic acid, trypsin inhibitors, and tannin that is present in most of the plant proteins. So it is a very favorable thing to use the extrusion because we use thermal and mechanical stress with the screws. So this also lead to an increase in the protein and starch digestibility and exploitability to produce ready-to-eat food products. Because let's say if you use a plant protein source directly without modification, you might have a lot of anti-nutritional compounds with your proteins. So using this method, you can eliminate most of the anti-nutritional factors because we are using high pressure and high temperature. So now there are many plant-based meat alternative companies around the world, but I would like to take Impossible Foods as an example on how they overcame a specific challenge in meat alternatives. So Impossible Foods CEO and the founder is Pat Brown. He is a medical doctor in his profession. He spent most of his career as a professor at Stanford University. He's well known for his pioneering in gene mapping. However, when he had his sabbatical leaves in 2009, he had a large ambition. So he embarked in his sabbatical leave, 18-month sabbatical leave, and then he had one mission to figure out how to eliminate the meat industry, which he would determine to be the world's most devastating environmental problem. So Mr. Brown ended his sabbatical leave with the conclusion that people would never cut meat out of their diet solely for the sake of environment. Even we saw in the with the Mintel graph I showed you that people are first concerned of their health, not of the environment. Environment and animal welfare comes second. So he concluded that the only way to truly beat meat would be fair and square on the free market. So how would he do that to recreate the meat using plants? Most of their ingredients are similar to what I explained in the common meat alternatives. So today I want to emphasize one key ingredient which make their product unique. That's heme. So back in 2011, they started with a simple question: what makes meat taste like meat? Then they figured out how to make it with plants. So they found that heme is what makes meat taste like meat. It is an essential molecule found in every living plant and animal, most abundantly in animals, and something we have been eating, craving since dawn of humanity. At Impossible Foods, their plant-based heme is made via fermentation of genetically engineered yeast. They start from extracting the DNA, which makes hemoglobin from soy root nodules. Then they insert it into a modified yeast to make more heme through the fermentation. So if you look at the down left-hand side of the slide, those are the common ingredients. You have the oil and the binders, the proteins, and the coconut oil. And this heme is the most important ingredient in their product. So how they extract the heme, they sow in the nodules of soy plants. You know, we have the symbiotic relationship with the legumes and the rhizobium bacteria. So this is an cross section of the root nodule of soy. So you can see it's in dark red in color. So they figure out what's the DNA responsible to make this leg hemoglobin. So they extract it out of the root nodule and they put it into the yeast, a special yeast that can reproduce the leg hemoglobin through the fermentation, and they extract that fermented through the fermented method. They extract the heme to be added into their product. I hope this video will work with the sound. If not, it's just whatever I explained in the pictures.
Heme is a beautiful iron-containing molecule, and it's essential for pretty much life on Earth. The heme in your blood grabs the oxygen from your lungs and carries it all around your body. And the amazing thing about heme, besides doing all that sort of stuff that enables life to exist on Earth, is that it's also what makes meat delicious.
We were the first to discover that heme is what makes meat taste like meat. It's highly abundant in animal muscle tissue, and if you were to eat meat raw, that bloody flavor that you get, that's heme. And when you cook meat, with all the different flavors and aromas that you get, that is catalyzed by heme as well.
The craving for meat is really a craving for heme and the iron and protein that it represents in the diet.
Every decision that we make is really driven by our values and our mission. We want to feed the population in 2050. We want to do it in a way that does not destroy the planet. All of the decisions that we've made have been to produce a product that we can make in a way that is scalable and sustainable and safe. And that applies to heme.
We surveyed a lot of proteins and we identified soy-like hemoglobin. Soy-like hemoglobin could come from one of two forms. One would be in its natural form, which is in the root nodules of soy plants. But the other would be fermentation, which is a far more scalable and sustainable way of making that protein. Yeasts are used for making other proteins, certain kinds of beers, wines, and so it's something people are familiar with. It's the yeast that we use makes its own heme molecule. We take the DNA for the soy-like hemoglobin protein and we insert that DNA into our yeasts.
Heme is what produces the explosion of flavor and aroma when you throw a burger on a grill, and it's what makes the Impossible Burger taste so delicious.
Well, that's the story of Impossible Burger. So I would like to wrap up this session with the research gaps we have seen in the plant protein arena, especially from the protein separation. So there are a lot of opportunities to see what's the most sustainable and effective ways of finding the optimum conditions for protein separation and modification. Like you can combine with can we go with the hybrid methods? Can we reduce more water and energy? Even with the dry fractionation, can we use electrostatic separation? And are there any methods that we can use to further purify our proteins? Or the question comes, do we need to further purify? Because for an example, in a meat alternative, you don't need to achieve like a 90% protein as an ingredient. You can use protein starch blend to make your meat alternative, because that's what we have seen in research, like having higher purity in your ingredient won't make a good final product. Sometimes you need that synergistic effect from the starch, fiber, and proteins to make a good final product. So that's one thing that we need to work on from the research aspect. And then further investigation needs to be done on the G/E, its genetic and environmental effect on the protein separation and on milling performance especially, how the G by E or the genetic and environment affect the milling performance and their classification, and also breeding programs to improve higher protein values in the our initial plant state, like for an example, pea, chickpea, mung bean, or any other pulse would have like 20 grams per 100 gram, or we call 20% protein in its initial state. So from that 20%, we are extracting protein up to 80% or 90% of protein. So is there any way through the breeding can we improve the plants to make seeds that have like 30% protein, 40% protein? So there are a lot of things to be done in the breeding side as well. And then in some food application, as I mentioned, the purity can be lead to some inefficient raw material and also higher cost. Like when you want to extract higher protein, when you want to have like a higher purity in your protein, it can be costly because now you have to go through the wet extraction, or either you go through dry fractionation and electrostatic separation. So high purity is not, it will not be the always be the answer. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It depends on your what's your final application. First you have to think, okay, do we need that purity, or are we looking for the functionality? So there's a new concept called now we are not focusing on the purity, we are focusing on the um, functionality aimed fractionation. We fractionate to a level that we want protein to be act in the final product. Like let's say, even though my fractionation method can extract up to 75%, it doesn't matter, because what's the protein percentage that need to be in the final product? So it will be coming back from the final application. Okay, I'm going to make a meat alternative, so then what's the good protein value I should have? Should I have starch and fiber in my product to make a good meat alternative? So based on that, we will come back and we will decide, okay, this is the fractionation level we need to do to extract proteins. And then finally, especially this is the biggest concern. If you now when we are fractionating, the entire presentation was on the protein. So you might question, so what are we going to do with the other things? I mentioned about dehulling. So with the dehulling, you separate most of the insoluble fiber. And then how about the starch? What are we going to do? So there are already started research project on these valorizing the core products like starch and fiber, how we can utilize those in different food products. So still there's a lot of opportunity to work on this valorizing part of the core products. So then I would like to summarize today's lecture to give you some key take-home messages. So initially, we learned about the need of plant proteins in the current context. There's a growing need because growing population. There's a question how we can feed them with sustainable protein sources. So that's why we need to move from animal proteins, because animal proteins alone can't help this problem. So we need to utilize the plant proteins. And then in the second part, we identified the current future plant protein sources and how to extract them from the dry fractionation and wet fractionation. And then I talk about how we can modify those native proteins to make them more favorable in applications, like using physical, chemical, biological. I only explained the biological methods, but still you can use the physical, chemical as well. So later we learned about the plant protein products, especially the meat alternative. Other than the meat alternatives, you can go for egg alternatives, dairy alternatives, and the meals and other snacks. So, and then later we learn about the success story from the Impossible Foods. So with that, I would like to wind up my presentation. And again, thank you for inviting me to do this guest lecture, and thank you for everyone who attended today.